Show up. Ready? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Chalkboard History, Volume 1. What is this? Number 5, I think? 5, 4, 5, 6? Anyways, welcome to Chalkboard History. So we've talked about everything from old history, new history. We ate sausages. We talked about ghosts and weddings. And then we talked about Army of Tennessee. And we talked about favorite Civil War sites. So this week, we've asked Kristi Farrow, the Battle of Franklin Trust's Director of African and African American History, to join us. Because this week's episode is going to be probably among the more serious of the ones that we've done so far. So today's topic is, who is Nathan Perkins? The reason that I thought this would be an interesting topic, other than what you're going to hear, which is pretty obvious, is that this really gets down into some of the complexities of the history that we deal with and the people that we deal with. And one of the things that Joseph and I talked about on a prior episode was, this sort of we're all Americans, meaning we're all sort of generally in the same boat. This story will show you that is patently absurd, actually, because Nathan Perkins is a bit of a mystery. So who is or who was Nathan Perkins?
Nathan Perkins was a slave named Gilbert Cheairs that was owned by Nathaniel Francis Cheairs III.
Okay.
And so when Nathaniel died, Gilbert was about 5 years old.
Okay, so let's be clear. We're at Rippavilla, and Nathaniel Cheairs number 4 was the person who had this, the house that we, the visitors come to every day and that we interpret. So we're talking about his father, Nat III.
And when Nathaniel III died, he left Gilbert to his wife.
And he died in when?
1846.
Right.
Sorry, so many 1840s in my mind right now. So 1846, he died. Gilbert was left actually to his wife, Sarah, and so was Gilbert's mother.
All right.
So his mother was named Mary Ann.
All right. So Gilbert's mother is Mary Ann.
Yes.
Gilbert was how old about in 1846?
He was 5,
right.
And his mother was about 30 at that time. And so they were both left to Sarah. And so at that point, she lived for quite a few more years. She didn't die until the 1850s. So when she died, Gilbert was almost 18 years old, and she gave Gilbert, her yellow boy, to her daughter Nancy Perkins.
Okay, so let's be clear. So she died, and in her will, she gave Gilbert, who was listed as a yellow boy,
yes,
mulatto,
yes,
biracial. So he was given to whom?
Her daughter, Nancy Perkins, who was in Arkansas.
All right, so Nancy Perkins married a man named Constantine Perkins, who was from Columbia, but
many names.
But they were living in Arkansas at the time, and Nancy is sisters with the Nat Cheairs that we talk about every day, that's more closely associated with Rippavilla. So what happens to Gilbert Cheairs when he goes to Arkansas?
Do you want me to say what the first thing that happens to him when he gets there? Because that's going to give away like the end of the...
Well, I think this is the point of what we began to unravel, because she didn't, I mean, I knew a little bit about this story, but she was doing all of the, deep research on this, and you don't really uncover exactly where this is going until you find the one thing, and you're like, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting this. So what happens to this now young man?
Okay, so let me tell you my theory on what happened, the reason that I looked at this pension application to begin with.
All right.
Because I knew that there was a Gilbert Cheairs, and I knew that he had been given to the Perkins family, and I found a pension application for the U.S. Army where there was a Nathan Perkins alias Gilbert Cheairs, and it at one point he enlisted, and I went and looked at his record, his CSR, and it said he'd enlisted in Arkansas. Okay. And I was like, okay, I know his name was Gilbert Cheairs. I know he was sent to Arkansas. This Nathan Perkins could be our Gilbert Cheairs. So I requested a copy.
And also, it's probably important to point out that the changing and alternating of names, especially within the black community, is not altogether unusual because
At all.
Because people would change, especially their last names, from master to master, and sometimes even post-war you'd see name changes, different spelling. So none of this was terribly unusual until you found out what was going on in Arkansas with the Perkins family.
Yes, so he got to Arkansas and they changed his name from Gilbert to Nathan. They said...
And also changed his last name.
Changed his last name.
Right, so he becomes Nathan Perkins.
Uh-huh. Do you want me to say why?
Well...
Because that's...
Right.
I mean, I will.
So at that point, he becomes Nathan Perkins. But where this story started was really at the end of Gilbert/Nathan's life.
Yes.
Because...
That's where the detail comes in.
Right. So you had found, of course, this pension application, and it was within the pension application that you began to understand why Nat's sister called him Nat or Nathan Perkins. And so what did the pension application tell you?
The pension said that they already had 2 Gilberts, and they didn't want another Gilbert, so they changed his name to Nat after his father.
After his father.
And that's all it said at that point, was they called him Nat after his father. One, completely dehumanizing to change a name because you already have 2 Gilberts.
Right.
You know, that's utterly reprehensible. But so at that point, you're reading along, you're like, okay, they changed his name to Nat after his father. And then you don't necessarily think that it has to be a Cheairs who was his father. They're just naming him Nathan because there were slaves here named Nathan as well.
Right.
Or, you know, so that's not the thing, but he actually says in the pension application that I was owned by my father. Now, at first, when you read that, you think he's actually owned by Nathaniel Cheairs III.
So when you first told me owned by my father, I was like, wait a second, it can't be number 3 because Nat number 3 because by 1841 he was well into his 70s. I mean, I guess it could be, but it was highly unlikely. And then I looked at the age and I was like, oh my goodness, I think he's actually talking about Nat number 4.
But what the thing in the pension application that really leads you to understand and believe that is that he says he had a conversation with him in 1866.
Right, and of course by that time, Nat the Third is long
dead. He's been dead since Gilbert was 5 years old.
So he never understood that his owner was not his father. His owner was actually, technically, his grandfather, and then his grandmother owned him, and then gave him away to what would have been an aunt. And then, so what happens? So before we go into this, let's talk a little bit about what happens to him. So the reason you were looking for this guy is we found several enslaved men who were here who became USCTs. So one of the things that captured my attention was he fought at this battle called Mark's Mill, which is April 25th, 1864, and it was one of many incidents. A lot of people talk about Fort Pillow because it's really well known. The massacre or murder of black soldiers happened in a lot of places, including Mark's Mill. There were at least 150 or so USCTs who were captured there, and another 100 or so were allegedly murdered. Well, he was captured, Gilbert was, at that battle. But prior to that...
But he did escape.
Right, but prior to him being a USCT, so some of you have probably heard about this, nonsense about black Confederates as if there were black soldiers in the Confederate Army. Gilbert actually says in his pension application...
He's so detailed, and he's perfect in his detail of his life. I wish every pension record was as good as his.
So he was attached. So he was attached to Sterling Price, who was a Confederate general at one point.
He was driving his wagons.
And he actually says driving his wagons. And he said what?
He said that I was a slave receiving no pay for my work.
There you go. Receiving no pay for my work. Yeah. So he escaped. He somehow got away.
He escaped after the Battle of what's Deanne?
Prairie Deanne.
Prairie Deanne. And then he made his way to General Steele in Cameron, Arkansas.
Frederick Steele, so he enlists, and then he fights at Mark's Mill.
And he's captured, he escapes.
He's captured and escapes.
And then he's in the...
Again.
Canebrake?
Yeah, he's in a canebrake. He's hiding. Canebrake. He hides in the sugar cane. So this is something that I think...
He does it for a long time. I don't know how that's possible.
Well, here's what happened. Confederates were hunting black soldiers. I mean, they were literally hunting them to either take them back to slavery or to kill them. And he hid in this canebrake for weeks.
Would they have buildings in there? Or is he just hiding in the, like, I've seen sugar cane. They had it at Ducrow.
He's hiding so that they can't find him.
It's crazy.
So then the war ends, and...
he actually enlisted after that. He found his way back to Little Rock, he says, and enlisted in the 2nd Heavy U.S. Colored Troop Heavy Battery.
Heavy artillery.
Heavy artillery.
Right.
So he was in that for the rest of the war.
So then the war ends, and the conversation he has with his owner, who was never his owner, but was his father.
Doesn't that make you understand how convoluted it can be at places like this? Because there's so many different people owning slaves that even the slaves sometimes didn't comprehend fully who was the owner.
Well, no.
I mean, that is interesting to me.
I don't think that's confusing at all. He was 5 years old. He had no idea.
But he was here till he was almost 20.
Yeah, but he didn't know. They probably never told him. And
because he says, I was raised by my father till I was 20.
So he just assumed that Nat number 4 was also his owner. To me, that's not incredibly relevant. What I think is really interesting is that he comes back after the war, and this white man and this biracial man have a conversation, and
which is stunning.
They seem to fully grasp and understand the situation actually both of them are in, and also the world in which they live. So what happens to Gilbert after that?
He comes to me as a conversation with Nat, and he comes as Nat Perkins to have this conversation, and he and Nathaniel Cheairs IV had this conversation, and Nat said to him that he wasn't ashamed to own him, and you shouldn't be ashamed to own me, which doesn't mean actual owning property, it means recognizing. So he was basically saying, I'm not ashamed to admit that you're my son, and you shouldn't be ashamed to admit that I'm your father.
But Gilbert doesn't stay here, does he?
No, he does not.
So
it's almost like they come to a peace, like an understanding and a peace between the two of them, and then he moves and he leaves and he goes to Memphis, and he lived in Memphis for the rest of his life, and he had a successful life.
It must have been interesting, because I've been thinking a lot about the fact that he's born here at Rippavilla. Regardless of who he thought owned him or whatnot, it's pretty evident from his testimony that Nat Cheairs IV was his father. So he lives here, for the better part of 20 years. And then he's gone, and he goes through, a couple of different things during the war. And then it is like he comes back here post-war to finally just resolve this thing in whatever way you can. And then he leaves, and he goes to Memphis.
I think a big part of him leaving would be the fact that he didn't have, his mother was sent away. When he was sent to Arkansas, his mother was separated from him and sent to Missouri, which I think is an important part of the story, because then he doesn't have that pull and that hold here, which would be his mother and potential siblings, which I do think that he had quite a few siblings as well.
His mother, Mary Ann, was sent to live with another one of Nat's sisters, Louisa, who married a guy named John Campbell, right? And they lived in Springfield, Missouri. And I think for me, that was the part of the story that struck the deepest chord, because that's an intentional move by Sarah Cheairs, Nat number 4's mother, to split them up. Now, it could have been unintentional, but I suspect very strongly that it's not, because
a mother doesn't do that unintentionally.
Why else would they have named him Nat? That's not a coincidence either. I think that the one sister knew, which means the other one probably knew, which meant the mother/grandmother knew, and it's really an intentional dissection of a mother from her child. Do we know what happened to Mary Ann?
No. I do not. I know that Gilbert's wife never met her because I've read the wife's pension application as well, and she said I think her name was Mary, but she never met her. So we know that when they're getting married, about 1880 is when Gilbert marries her. That Marianne is potentially gone by this point. So, and I have not been able to find her on an 1870 or 1880 census, but I don't know what last name she went by. Mary is a very, very common name. So who knows what we'll know tomorrow, but as of today.
And Gilbert has a tragic end.
He does. It's so terribly sad. For the rest of his life, he really worked on steamships up and down the Mississippi River. But as he got to be older, what he was a night guard at a factory in Memphis. And he had just gotten paid, and somebody robbed him and stole the entire $10 paycheck that he had in his pocket.
Right.
So, and they didn't find him until the next day. So he was murdered. It's all over the newspapers down there.
And he was listed in the newspapers, which was 1912. Just think about that. That's the year the Titanic sank. You know, Gilbert lived that long. Yeah. And he was murdered.
And Nat Cheairs was still alive at this point. My heart always goes to, did he know?
And he's listed in the paper as what?
Gilbert Cheairs.
Not Nathan Perkins.
Not Nathan Perkins.
He's listed as Gilbert Cheairs. And so, so Nat dies a year and a half later. And we don't know whether Nat and Gilbert really ever spoke again or ever had any communication. But I think the sad part of his story, or maybe one of the saddest parts of the story, is he's buried today at the Memphis National Cemetery among many other USCTs, many other U.S. soldiers. And he has a very modern sort of, they're standard U.S. military markers. And it says Nathan Perkins because that's the name under which he enlisted. So Veterans Affairs, when they put it up, they didn't know any of this. We didn't until pretty recently, and so we're going to make some effort as best we can to get
I've already sent 2 letters
to get his headstone changed to reflect his real name, which was Gilbert Cheairs.
It seems like the ultimate unfairness because he was born Gilbert. He was Nat for such a minimal amount of his life, just a couple years, and then in the Army, which he was only. We can very clearly say that for maybe 6 years of his entire life that he went by Nat Perkins. He got his pension under Gilbert Cheairs because it says Gilbert Cheairs on it. It says alias Nat Perkins.
Married as Gilbert Cheairs.
He was married at Gilbert Cheairs. His children were Cheairs. He worked as Gilbert Cheairs. He bought his house as Gilbert Cheairs.
Right. Well, he was Gilbert Cheairs. That was his name.
Yeah.
So he's,
and then the U.S. military puts Nathan Perkins on his grave.
Well,
so
and again, they didn't know that. That's someone in the VA office who doesn't know anything because they're just going through the names. So the other part of this that we should probably talk about is, is this conclusive? Well, there's no DNA evidence.
Yeah.
There's no testimony from Nat Cheairs. But one of the things we've learned is that Gilbert Cheairs would have had no reason to lie. It's not like this was beneficial to his application. Mm-hmm. As we learned with Fountain Branch Carter fathering a child with an enslaved woman, there was no benefit to that man to list Fountain Branch as his father on his death certificate. Mm-hmm. This was much more commonplace than probably a lot of us would like to admit today, and the complexities of the relationships are, oh my gosh, talk about something that was, as Billie Holiday would say, strange fruit, but this is like forbidden fruit. And so I think people knew about it, but then they did a really good job of covering it up. The question I know that I have is I wonder if Nat Cheairs number 4, if his wife, if their children, if they ever knew any of this, or if this was something that was contained within this segment of the family. And I don't know that we will ever know, because Nat gets married to Susan the same year
3 months later
that Gilbert is born. And so let's just, just to play this out, let's say Susan never knows, okay? Listen, his mom knew. People are great at 19th century people were incredible at keeping secrets. They're incredible. But let's just say that she didn't. Nat Cheairs marries this woman. knowing full well he is going to have a child with a woman that his father owns.
It's there every day.
Just think about that. Think about, wrap your head around that, and you begin to see that the dynamics of the human interaction that go on at a place like this is, it's really pretty stunning. I don't think we mentioned this, that Mary or Marianne and Nat were almost the same age. And because Nat was born here, she almost certainly was born here. They grew up together. I mean, they probably knew each other from the time they were children. And so Nat's born in 1818. In 1841, he's 23 years old. And you start to piece these, you start to piece the numbers together, and you're like, yeah. But I remember years ago when people denied that Thomas Jefferson he couldn't have possibly fathered children with Sally Hemings. How could he do such a thing? And my thought was, well, why wouldn't he? I mean, this sort of stuff has gone on, forever. And I think this actually makes you think, my hope, and we're going to try and figure out how we work this into daily interpretation, because you don't want it to be salacious, like, well, Nat Cheairs fathered a child with an enslaved woman. There has to be a tactful way to tell the story about Gilbert and his mother, Marianne, not within the context of somehow they're connected to Nat. It's that they were their own people, and Gilbert was the product of this, whatever it was, and that he lived a long life. He served in the U.S. Army, and that his story is important too. And
they both would have served in, can you imagine? Nat was in the Confederate Army and his son was in the U.S. Army. And this is the first time that I've really made that connection when you just said that.
Well,
that's insane.
Yeah, and you just said it. His son served in the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
So this isn't like brother against brother. This is father against son.
I will say that this is maybe now when I'm reading the pension applications, or even we just came across a Nathan Cheairs who had a will, and our Nathaniel Cheairs IV was the executor on this black man's will in 1867, 1868. In my head, I thought, I wonder if that man was related to him. It's exactly where my mind goes. Now, even if it's not a theory that I can prove or not a theory that might be true, it's just, now I'm suspicious. Now I'm like, I wonder if that was his brother, because it's right about his age. And I'm like, I wonder why that man owned property in 1867.
And you know that Marianne had other children, right?
Yes, she did.
So we do suspect it's possible that Gilbert is not alone, but we don't know. And I think for anyone out there who would think, they're just tarnishing Nat Cheairs' name. No, we're not. We're just telling the truth. But this is what people said about Jefferson. A guy who worked for us for years was working at Monticello at the time, around 2000, when that story was finally they broke down the walls and it became part of interpretation. And about half the staff quit. In
Monticello?
They just didn't want to be part of that at all. And I think that if anybody's story's been tarnished, if this story is true, which we think based on the facts that it is, it's Gilbert Cheairs, who's buried under another name because he got tossed around as an object between white families.
That's interesting, because when we found out that that Gus was Fountainbridge Carter's son, there was an employee that had worked at Carter House for quite some time who told me we shouldn't tell anybody, it was a secret. If he wanted it to be a secret, I'm like, he went to the county court with 2 witnesses and paid a fee to make a public statement, it's just...
I think that those kinds of stories, this story, even the story, if you dialed backwards to Jefferson's era, the interaction between white and black, especially sexual relationships and children, was an open secret. Meaning it wasn't really a secret. This stuff went on all the time, and because it was such a contained environment, meaning slavery and those who owned slaves, you could control what was happening on the plantation, because those people were never going to be able to literally get away unless they escape, so they couldn't tell the story. But what happens afterwards, I made a comment to someone the other day that I think some of the most prejudiced, bigoted times in this country are actually in the early 20th century, which is ironic. It's not among the people who actually, I think, own slaves. There's a much more blending and common reaction or common interaction between the races versus 50 years later when people try to do everything they can to separate it and to cover things up, to make sure that these things really became secrets. We would never discuss them because Grandpa couldn't possibly have done that. I remember finding out that it's not even remotely close to this, but like that my grandparents got married because, great-grandparents, that great-grandma got pregnant. And I was like, wow. So, great-grandpa and great-grandpa did that too, just like everybody else. And so I was thinking about Nat and this woman, and it's like slave, not slave, black, white. You never know what can happen. And I think Gilbert is that, he's part of that storyline too. So we are going to tell the story of Gilbert Cheairs. We are probably going to interpret it, maybe not on a daily basis, but on the slavery tours and slave tours, maybe on the extended tours. I think that as we continue to look for USCTs who came out of Rippavilla, he just becomes a natural he becomes a natural storyline. I think we'll probably write about him in an issue of the Dispatch. And
we have at least 10 USCT now.
Right.
From all of these pension applications we've been collecting.
Right. So 10 just from Rippavilla.
Yeah, just from here.
Right.
And they had different names too. So in the pension applications that Jenny and I found at the archives last week, we're going through and there's a man named Hamilton Potter, I think. And he says he joined the USCT, and he describes the regiment. And he says, I was owned by Nathan Perkins. I'm like, who is this guy? A Hamilton Potter. And then there's a James Williams. And there is, what was the last one? William Curry. Like 3 men that I had absolutely no idea were here because they had different names after the American Civil War.
So 2 thoughts before we wind up. I'm really proud of being able to have this kind of research either done and then to tell people about it and to figure out the best or the most appropriate or the most effective way to interpret it, to tell people about this long, not forgotten story. This was a story that was completely unknown. So there's that side, but there's also the side of me that thinks about, all the people that worked at Rippavilla and all of the people who've lived and worked in Murray County, or just anywhere. I mean, it's not like we're the smartest people in the room. Yeah. This information has always been available. It's been sitting in these pension applications for 130, 120, 110 years. Mm-hmm. It's just been sitting there waiting to be found. And sneak preview, like we did at one of the other, in one of our prior episodes, we are going to tell the story of Earl Van Dorn in an upcoming episode. And let me tell you, you might want to get 2 seat belts for what we're going to talk about with Earl Van Dorn, because I think everybody's heard this sort of salacious story about his murder. I assure you, it's nothing like what you've ever heard or what you might think it could be. It's actually far worse. Yeah. And so these are the things that I think are important to reveal, because it shows that they lived in a different time, but it
makes me proud.
People are the same. People do the same things. They make the same mistakes. Mm-hmm. They cover up the same, they cover up mistakes. They'll try and break up the mistake. They'll try and do everything they can to not act like human beings have always acted.
I don't know. I just think it makes me feel good that we're trying to tell Gilbert's story.
And that's what
trying to tell all the other stories that we find, because they're just there and just in paper waiting for us.
And that's what this is. This is a story about Gilbert Cheairs and his mother, Mary Ann.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly it's a story about Nat Cheairs, but this is a story about Gilbert Cheairs.
And think of the humanity or the inhumanity that it just creates within like the entire context of Ripavella, because we don't have just this one little narrow view. We've got people that live here and back there and over here, and all of those people are interacting on a daily basis, and it's not just this one white family. There were far more black people that lived on this farm than white people, and you can't understand how life was at Ripavella without understanding their lives as well. So if everybody could write a pension as nice as Nat's and tell us every single detail in their life, I mean, think of the complexities we would have of this farm.
Well, it reminds me of someone who asked a question some time ago about, well, why do we have to talk about slavery at a plantation? And I was like, well, gosh, the list is pretty long. And here's another example, because Nat Cheairs lived in the big house, and Gilbert and his mother didn't.
Yep.
And never did. But they were as real as you and I are. Mm-hmm. They walked the world. It was springtime, it was fall, it was another birthday, it was another year. They were just as real. And they live in the same place, and they live in almost divergent universes. But Nathan Perkins, Gilbert Cheairs, is really who he was. And so we're going to work as hard as we can to get that grave marker changed and to tell a little more about not just his story, but other people we think that are a lot like them. So thanks again for watching. We've got more fun stuff coming up in weeks ahead. Thanks again.